The black sedan with government plates pulled away from the curb as I stood frozen on my apartment steps, holding an envelope bearing the presidential seal. Inside, cream-colored stationery with gold embossing spelled out words I'd dreamed about since I was 12 years old. The president requests your immediate presence at the White House for consideration of a senior advisory position. My hands trembled as I read the date. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. 3 hours earlier, I'd been scrubbing tables at Murphy's Diner on the wrong side of Millfield, Ohio, listening to my sister Brooklyn laugh into her phone about how some people never learn their place. Now I held proof that everything was about to change. Let me take you back to where this really began. 3 months ago, on a Tuesday that started like every other Tuesday in my 26 years of existing in this forgotten corner of America, the morning fog clung to Main Street like a dirty secret, wrapping around the boarded-up storefronts and rusted pickup trucks that defined downtown Millfield. I'd grown up watching this place slowly die, factory by factory, dream by dream. The paper mill closed when I was 14. The automotive plant followed 2 years later. By the time I graduated high school, half the town had already given up and moved away. The other half stayed behind to remind the rest of us why leaving was impossible. I pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's Diner at 5:30 in the morning, gravel crunching under the tires of my 15-year-old Honda Civic. The car made sounds that would concern a mechanic, but mechanics cost money. I didn't. Inside the diner, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of yellow that made everyone look sick. The smell of burnt coffee and yesterday's grease hung in the air like incense in a church nobody wanted to attend. "You're late," Dolores called from behind the counter, not looking up from the register she was counting down. Dolores Murphy had inherited the diner from her father, along with his opinion that employees were basically thieves waiting for the right opportunity. "The clock hasn't hit 5:30 yet," I replied, tying my apron strings with practiced efficiency. The uniform was a pale blue polyester that had seen better decades, with Madison embroidered in fading white thread above the breast pocket. "Close enough." She slammed the register drawer shut with unnecessary force. "Table 6 needs to be reset. The coffee machine's acting up again, and your sister called." My stomach dropped. Brooklyn never called the diner unless she wanted something or had something particularly cruel to say. Usually both. What did she want? Dolores shrugged, her expression suggesting she'd enjoyed whatever message she'd been asked to deliver. "Said to tell you the university called her back about your application. Something about references." The coffee pot I'd been reaching for nearly slipped from my hand. I'd applied to Ohio State's graduate program in public policy 3 weeks ago. A long shot that represented every penny of savings I'd managed to scrape together over 2 years of double shifts and skipped meals. The application fee alone had meant eating ramen for a week, but I'd done it anyway, driven by something I couldn't quite name but refused to ignore. "Did she say what about the references?" "Nope, just said you'd know what it meant." Dolores turned away, but not before I caught the smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. The morning rush at Murphy's consisted mainly of truckers passing through and local guys who worked construction when they could find it. I moved through the motions automatically, coffee refills, order taking, plate clearing, while my mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Brooklyn had been one of my 3 references, along with Miss Patterson, my high school government teacher, and Reverend Williams from the Methodist Church where I'd volunteered for the past 5 years. I'd asked Brooklyn to be a reference because she had a college degree and a respectable job at the bank downtown. What I hadn't fully considered was that she also had a talent for sabotage that she'd been perfecting since we were children. By 10 o'clock, the breakfast crowd had thinned to a few regulars nursing coffee and reading newspapers that were mostly advertisements for stores that had already closed. I was wiping down tables when the bell above the door chimed, and Brooklyn walked in wearing her bank uniform, navy blazer, pressed slacks, the kind of confident stride that announced she belonged somewhere better than here. She was 3 years older than me, blonde where I was brunette, curves where I was angles. Everything about Brooklyn suggested easy living, from her manicured nails to her SUV parked outside that she somehow afforded on a bank teller's salary. She'd been the pretty one, the popular one, the one everyone expected to make something of herself. That she'd ended up working at Millfield Savings and Loan was considered a temporary setback, not a permanent condition. Hey, she slid into a booth by the window, the one with the cracked vinyl seat that we never bothered to fix because it wasn't worth the expense. Heard you wanted to know about that phone call? I set down my rag and walked over, trying to read her expression. Brooklyn had perfected the art of looking innocent while delivering devastating news. It was a skill that had served her well growing up in a house where attention was scarce and blame was plentiful. The university called you? She opened the menu, even though she'd never ordered anything at Murphy's in the 10 years I'd worked there. I wanted to verify some information about your character and qualifications. My heart hammered against my ribs. And? Well, I told them the truth. She looked up from the menu, eyes wide with manufactured sincerity. That you're a hard worker, very reliable, always been the responsible one in the family. Relief started to bloom in my chest, but something in her tone warned me to wait. I also mentioned that you've been working at this diner since you were 16, and that stability is really important to you. How you've never actually lived anywhere else. Never really been anywhere else. I explained that Millfield is where you belong, where you're comfortable. That leaving would probably be really overwhelming for someone with your limitations. The word hit like a physical blow. Limitations? Oh, your anxiety about new situations, how you get overwhelmed in crowds, the panic attacks you used to have in high school when you had to give presentations. She ticked off each item on her fingers like she was reading from a grocery list. I thought it was important they understand who they'd be accepting, so they could make an informed decision. The diner seemed to tilt around me. Those panic attacks had happened during my junior year, when Dad lost his job and Mom started drinking more, when the house felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. I'd confided in Brooklyn during one of our rare moments of sisterly solidarity, never imagining she'd file it away as ammunition for later use. You told them I have anxiety. I told them you have a history of struggling with high-pressure situations, which is true, right? Remember when you wanted to try out for the debate team and changed your mind at the last minute? Or when you applied to that internship in Columbus and then withdrew your application? Each example felt like another nail in a coffin I hadn't realized was being built. The debate team tryouts. I'd skipped them because Mom had fallen down the stairs drunk the night before and I'd spent the evening in the emergency room. The Columbus internship. I'd withdrawn because Dad's unemployment had run out and we needed my diner wages to keep the lights on. But Brooklyn knew all of this. She'd been there for both incidents, had seen me make the difficult choice between my own aspirations and my family's immediate needs. She'd simply rewritten the narrative in a way that made me look unstable instead of sacrificial. Why would you tell them that? My voice came out smaller than I intended. Brooklyn closed the menu and leaned back in the booth, studying me with something that might have been a pity if it hadn't felt so cold. Because I love you, Madison, and I don't want to see you get hurt. You're not built for that world. All that competition, all those people who went to fancy schools and know how to talk to important people. You'd be miserable. That should be my choice to make. Should it though? You've never been good at making choices. You just react to whatever crisis is happening around you. That's not a character flaw. It's just who you are. Some people are leaders, and some people are followers. Some people chase dreams, and some people stay home and take care of the people who need them. She reached across the table and patted my hand with the kind of gentle condescension usually reserved for children and pets. Mom and Dad need you here. The community needs you here. You're the stable one. The one people can count on. That's a beautiful thing, Madison. Don't underestimate the value of being dependable. The bell above the door chimed again as a customer entered, but I couldn't move. I sat there absorbing what Brooklyn had done, the casual cruelty of it, the way she'd managed to frame sabotage as protection. She'd taken every vulnerable moment I'd ever shared with her, and weaponized it into a character assassination designed to keep me exactly where I was. Besides, she continued, standing up and smoothing down her blazer, even if they had accepted you, how would you have paid for? You barely make enough to cover your rent and groceries. Graduate school isn't for people like us, Madison. It's for people who can afford to spend 2 years not earning money while they play intellectual games. She paused at the edge of the table, looking down at me with what she probably thought was sisterly concern. "You'll thank me for this someday, when you're still here, still part of this community, still connected to the people who actually matter in your life. Dreams are nice, but reality is better. At least reality doesn't leave you broke and disappointed." After she left, I sat in that cracked vinyl booth for another 10 minutes, staring out the window at Main Street. A few cars drifted by, their occupants probably heading to jobs they'd been doing for decades. In a town that had been dying for just as long, I could see my reflection in the glass, 26 years old, wearing a uniform that smelled like other people's breakfast, living a life that had somehow become smaller than I'd ever intended. But what Brooklyn hadn't counted on was that her little speech had clarified something for me. She was right about one thing. I had always been the one who reacted to crises instead of creating opportunities. I'd spent years accommodating everyone else's needs, making choices based on what would cause the least conflict, what would keep the peace, what would maintain the status quo. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. That afternoon, I drove to the public library, the one building in downtown Millfield that still suggested possibility, and spent 3 hours researching every scholarship, grant, and work-study program available to graduate students in Ohio. I filled out applications for 7 different funding sources, wrote essays about my goals and qualifications, and submitted them all before I could talk myself out of it. 2 weeks later, I received an email from Ohio State. Despite the concerns raised by one of my references, they were impressed by my academic record and community involvement. They offered me admission to the program along with a research assistantship that would cover tuition and provide a modest living stipend. I would start in the fall semester, 5 months away. I printed out the acceptance letter and carried it in my apron pocket for 3 days before I told anyone. When I finally shared the news with my parents, Dad nodded slowly and said he was proud of me. Mom asked who was going to take care of them when I was gone. Neither reaction surprised me. Brooklyn's response was more subtle. She didn't congratulate me or express anger. Instead, she started a quiet campaign of concern. She worried aloud to our parents about my ability to handle the stress of graduate school. She mentioned to coworkers at the bank that I was making a risky decision, leaving a steady job for an uncertain future. She talked about how expensive Columbus was, how competitive the program would be, how easy it would be for me to fail and come home with nothing but debt. Her message was consistent. Madison is making a mistake, and we need to protect her from herself. But I kept working at the diner, saving every penny I could, and counting down the days until I could prove her wrong. I started reading policy journals and academic papers in my spare time, preparing myself for coursework that would be more demanding than anything I'd encountered. I researched professors whose work interested me, thinking about potential thesis topics, imagining conversations about ideas that mattered. For the first time in my adult life, I was planning instead of just surviving. It felt dangerous and exhilarating, and absolutely necessary. The letter from the White House arrived on a Thursday in late July, 3 weeks before I was supposed to start graduate school. I'd been expecting nothing more significant than a utility bill or grocery store circular. Instead, I found an envelope that would change everything, addressed to Madison Claire Thompson in precise block letters that suggested governmental efficiency. Inside, the letter was brief and formal. "Dear Ms. Thompson, your academic work and community involvement have come to our attention. The President would like to meet with you regarding a potential position on the domestic policy team. Please report to the White House tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Transportation will be provided." I read it 3 times before the words began to make sense. Then I sat down on my apartment floor and tried to figure out what academic work they could possibly be referring to. I was a diner waitress who'd been accepted to graduate school. I'd never published anything, never participated in any research, never done anything that would justify the attention of anyone more important than the Millfield City Council. The only thing I'd written recently was a policy brief about rural economic development that I'd submitted as part of my graduate school application, a 20-page analysis of how federal programs could be restructured to better serve communities like Millfield. It was supposed to be a writing sample, nothing more. I'd researched it carefully, proposed specific solutions, and argued my points with passion if not sophistication. Apparently, someone had been paying attention. That evening, I called in sick to the diner for the first time in 2 years. I drove to the mall in the next town over and bought the best outfit I could afford, a navy blazer, white blouse, and black slacks that made me look like someone who belonged in important meetings. I spent the night practicing how to shake hands, how to sit up straight, how to speak clearly and confidently about ideas I believed in. I didn't tell my family about the letter. Not Brooklyn would find a way to undermine it, to suggest I was being set up for disappointment, to warn me about getting ideas above my station. My parents would worry about the cost of the trip, the time away from work, the possibility that I was being naive about something too good to be true. Instead, I set my alarm for 4 in the morning and planned to be gone before anyone knew I was missing. The government sedan would pick me up at 6, according to the instructions. By the time anyone noticed I wasn't at Murphy's Diner, I'd be on my way to Washington, D.C., carrying nothing but determination and a 20-page policy brief that had somehow caught the attention of the most powerful office in the world. The girl who'd let her sister sabotage her dreams was gone. The woman who was about to walk into the White House wasn't sure who she was yet, but she knew she was tired of being underestimated. The black sedan arrived precisely at 6 a.m., its engine purring with the kind of quiet confidence that came with government funding. I watched from my apartment window as the driver stepped out, a woman in her 40s wearing a crisp suit and an expression that suggested she'd done this many times before. She checked her watch, scanned the street with professional efficiency, then walked to my door. Madison Thompson. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "That's me, Agent Patricia Caldwell, Secret Service. Ready for your trip to Washington?" The surreal nature of the moment hit me as I followed her to the car. 12 hours ago, I'd been serving coffee to truckers and calculating whether I could afford groceries this week. Now I was sliding into leather seats that probably cost more than my monthly rent, heading toward a conversation that could change everything. Agent Caldwell handed me a briefing folder as we pulled away from my apartment complex. "Background information on today's meeting. You'll want to review this during the flight. Flight? Small government aircraft. We'll be in Washington in 90 minutes. She glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "First time flying?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. The folder in my hands felt substantial, official. On the cover, printed in government sans serif font, briefing materials. Madison C. Thompson, Domestic Policy Consultation. Inside, I found documents that made my head spin. My policy brief on rural economic development had been annotated by someone with impressive credentials. Margin notes questioning my assumptions, highlighting specific proposals, suggesting additional research angles. But these weren't criticisms. They read like the comments of someone genuinely engaged with my ideas, someone who saw potential worth developing. More disturbing were the other documents in the folder. A complete academic transcript going back to elementary school, employment records from Murphy's Diner, including performance evaluations I'd never seen, character references from people I barely knew, Mr. Turson from high school, Reverend Williams, even Dolores Murphy, who apparently had more positive things to say about me when talking to federal investigators than she'd ever expressed in person. But it was the final document that made my stomach clench. A detailed report on my family background, compiled by someone who'd done their homework thoroughly. My father's employment history, including the series of factory closures that had defined his working life. My mother's struggles with alcohol, documented through hospital visits and police reports I'd hoped no one would ever connect. Brooklyn's financial situation, which turned out to be far more precarious than her designer clothes and confident demeanor suggest. According to the report, my sister was 3 months behind on her car payments, maxed out on 4 credit cards, and facing potential termination from the bank for attendance issue. The woman who'd lectured me about being realistic and staying in my lane was drowning in debt while maintaining a facade of success that had fooled everyone in Millfield, including me. The aircraft was smaller than I'd expected, but more luxurious than anything I'd ever seen. Leather seats, mahogany tables, windows large enough to watch the world shrink below us. I spent the flight reading and rereading the briefing materials, trying to understand how I'd ended up here, What connection existed between a diner waitress's policy brief and the attention of the federal government? The answer became clearer as I read deeper into the fold. My proposal for rural economic development wasn't just an academic exercise. It directly addressed problems the current administration was struggling to solve: factory closures, population decline, infrastructure decay, the collapse of small-town America. I'd written about these issues not as abstract policy challenges, but as lived experiences, proposing solutions that came from understanding how government programs actually functioned at ground level. Agent Caldwell had been silent during most of the flight, but as we began our descent into Washington, she looked up from her own paperwork. Nervous, terrified, she smiled for the first time since I'd met her. Good. People who aren't nervous in the White House usually aren't paying attention. She paused, studying me with what seemed like genuine curiosity. Can I ask you something? When you wrote that policy brief, did you know anyone would read it besides admissions committee? I thought maybe a professor might look at it. Eventually, you proposed restructuring 3 major federal programs and creating 2 new ones. That's not typical graduate school application material. I shrugged, unsure how to explain that growing up in Millfield had given me a front row seat to policy failure. I wrote about what I knew needed fixing. That's exactly why you're here. The White House was smaller than it looked on television, but more imposing than I'd expect. Security checkpoints, metal detectors, background checks that had apparently been completed before I arrived. Agent Caldwell guided me through corridors lined with portraits of people who'd shaped history, past rooms where decisions affecting millions of lives were made daily. We stopped outside an office marked Deputy Chief of Staff, Domestic Policy. Agent Caldwell knocked once, waited for a response, then opened the door. "Ms. Thompson," she announced. Right on time. The woman behind the desk looked up from a stack of documents that seemed to tower impossibly high. "Dr. Jennifer Martinez," according to the nameplate, with credentials listed beneath her name that made my community college education feel microscopic. Harvard undergraduate, Yale Law, a PhD in economics from MIT. She'd served in 3 previous administrations, authored 2 books on domestic policy, and somehow found time to read policy briefs submitted by small-town diner waitresses. "Madison, thank you for coming." Martinez stood and extended her hand with the kind of confident grip that suggested she'd shaken hands with presidents and prime ministers. "Please, sit. We have a lot to discuss." The office was exactly what I'd expected from someone at her level. Diplomas and awards covering one wall, photographs with important people covering another, bookshelves filled with volumes on economics and policy analysis. But her desk was refreshingly chaotic, covered with coffee-stained papers and sticky notes that suggested she actually worked here rather than just posed for pictures. "I'll be direct," Dr. Martinez said, settling back into her chair. "Your policy brief landed on my desk 3 weeks ago through channels I'm not entirely sure I understand. Someone flagged it as worth reading, and after I read it, I flagged it as worth acting." She pulled out a copy of my brief, marked with so many annotations that the margins looked like a battlefield. "You've identified problems that we've been struggling with for months, and you've proposed solutions that are both innovative and practical. More importantly, you've written about these issues with the kind of authentic understanding that comes from living them, not just studying them. I don't understand how anyone even saw it. The admissions committee at Ohio State has a relationship with our office. Occasionally they forward application materials that might be of interest to us. Your brief was the first one in 2 years that made it past my initial screening." Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her expression becoming more intense. "Madison, I'm going to ask you some questions that might seem strange, but I need honest answers. When you wrote about the failure of federal job retraining programs, were you thinking about anyone specific? My father, he went through 3 different retraining programs after the paper mill closed. Each one promised to prepare him for jobs that didn't exist anymore. And when did you propose creating Regional Economic Development Council?" I was thinking about how decisions get made in Washington by people who've never lived in places like Millfield, how programs that look good on paper fall apart when they hit reality. Dr. Martinez nodded, making note. What about your suggestion for infrastructure investment tied to population retention metrics? Every road improvement, every broadband expansion, every federal dollar should be measured by whether it helps people stay in their communities or forces them to leave. Right now, we're spending money to help places die faster. Exactly. Dr. Martinez set down her pen and looked at me directly. Madison, how familiar are you with the President's Rural Initiative? I'd read about it in the news, but only in broad stroke. Campaign promises about revitalizing small-town America, bringing jobs back to areas that had been written off by previous administrations. I know it's a priority for this administration. It's more than a priority. It's the centerpiece of our domestic agenda for the next 3 years. We're proposing to invest $200 billion in rural economic development, infrastructure improvement, and job creation. It's the largest federal investment in small-town America since the New Deal. The numbers were so large they felt abstract. But Dr. Martinez wasn't finished. The problem is that we're designing these programs the same way Washington always designs programs, with good intentions and limited understanding of how they'll actually work. We have economists who can model economic impact, policy analysts who can structure legislation, and political operatives who can build coalitions. What we don't have is someone who understands what it's like to watch a community die from the inside. She stood and walked to the window, which offered a view of the rose garden. Your brief doesn't just propose solutions, Madison, it explains why previous solutions have failed, and it does so from the perspective of someone who's watched them fail. That's rare in this building. I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. Dr. Martinez turned back to face me. I'm asking if you'd be willing to put your graduate school plans on hold for 2 years to help us design and implement programs that might actually work. I'm asking if you'd consider joining our domestic policy team as a senior advisor for rural development. The room seemed to tilt around me. Senior advisor, White House, programs affecting millions of people, numbers with more zeros than I'd ever contemplated in my personal life. I don't have any experience with. You have exactly the experience we need. You understand how federal programs interact with local communities, because you've lived in a local community where federal programs have failed repeatedly. You know what doesn't work because you've seen it not work. You know what people need because you've needed it yourself. Dr. Martinez returned to her desk and pulled out another folder. This position comes with a salary that would pay for graduate school twice over, housing allowance, health insurance, security clearance, and the opportunity to shape policy that could affect millions of people who grew up in places like Millfield. She slid the folder across the desk. Take your time reading through this. But Madison, I want you to understand something. This administration is committed to proving that small-town America matters, that rural communities deserve more than empty promises and photo opportunities. We can't do that without people who understand what we're fighting for. I opened the folder with hands that weren't quite steady. The job description read like something from a different universe. Senior Advisor for Rural Development, Executive Office of the President. Responsibilities include policy development, interagency coordination, stakeholder engagement, and strategic planning for the administration's rural initiative. The salary figure at the bottom of the page was more money than I'd made in the last 3 years combined. You should know, Martinez continued, that this conversation is happening because someone believes in your potential. The president personally reviewed your brief and requested that we reach out to you. This isn't charity or affirmative action. This is recognition of talent that we need. The weight of possibility settled over me like a heavy coat. Everything I'd dreamed about during those late nights at the diner, every policy paper I'd read by flashlight after closing, every conversation I'd imagined having with people who could actually change things, it was all suddenly within reach. But with possibility came responsibility. If I took this job, I wouldn't just be representing myself. I'd be speaking for everyone who'd grown up watching their communities disappear, everyone who'd been told their problems were too small or too complicated to matter, everyone who'd been written off as collateral damage in larger economic trends. How long do I have to decide? The position starts Monday, but if you need time to think. I don't need time to think. The words came out before I'd fully formed the thought. But once I'd said them, I knew they were true. I need to make some phone calls. Dr. Martinez, there's a secure phone in the office next door, take as long as you need. As I walked toward the door, she called after me, Madison, your sister's assessment of your capabilities was interesting reading. I turned back, unsure how to respond. She was wrong about almost everything. Martinez said quietly. But she was right about one thing, this will change your life. The question is whether you're ready for that change. In the adjacent office, I sat alone with a phone that could connect me to anyone in the world and tried to figure out where to start. Not with my family. Not yet. They'd have questions I wasn't ready to answer, concerns that would complicate a decision that felt surprisingly clear. Instead, I called Ohio State and withdrew my acceptance to graduate school. The conversation was brief and professional. They understood that opportunities like this didn't come along often, and they wished me well. Then I called Murphy's Diner and quit my job. Effective immediately. Dolores was less understanding. Finally, I called my apartment complex and gave notice on my leave. I'd lived in that one-bedroom apartment for 4 years, but it took less than 3 minutes to end that chapter of my life. When I returned to Dr. Martinez's office, she was exactly where I'd left her, reviewing documents that would probably shape someone's life in ways they'd never know. Well, when do I start? The White House Personnel Office operated with the efficiency of a Swiss watch and the thoroughness of a criminal investigation. By Friday afternoon, less than 24 hours after I'd accepted the position, I had a security clearance application, thicker than my high school yearbook, a temporary identification badge that opened doors I'd only seen on television, and a desk in the Eisenhower Executive Office building with a view of the West Wing that still made my head spin. What I didn't have was any idea how to tell my family that their lives were about to change as dramatically as mine. My first assignment came from Dr. Martinez herself. Conduct a comprehensive review of existing rural development programs to identify systemic failures and missed opportunities. It sounded academic until she handed me access codes to databases containing 20 years of federal spending data, program evaluations, and economic impact studies that had never been released to the public. The president wants to know where we've been throwing money into black holes, she explained, settling into the chair across from my new desk. More importantly, he wants to know why programs that look successful in Washington produce such disappointing results in places like your hometown. The answer, I discovered over the next week, was both simpler and more complex than anyone wanted to admit. Federal rural development programs failed because they were designed by people who viewed small-town America as a problem to be solved rather than a community to be supported. Every initiative focused on transformation rather than preservation, on moving people toward opportunities instead of bringing opportunities to people. I spent 12-hour days diving through reports that painted a picture of systematic misunderstanding. The Small Business Administration had loaned millions to entrepreneurs in rural areas, but the businesses that received funding were overwhelmingly service industries that served local populations, rather than export industries that could bring new money into struggling communities. The Department of Agriculture had invested heavily in broadband infrastructure, but failed to account for the fact that high-speed internet was useless if local schools couldn't afford to train teachers to use it effectively. Most damaging was the Department of Labor's job retraining programs, which had successfully prepared thousands of workers for positions in industries that were also declining. My father's experience wasn't unique. He was part of a cohort of displaced manufacturing workers who'd been retrained for jobs in retail, food service, and basic healthcare, all of which paid less than their previous positions, and offered no real path toward economic stability. But the deeper I dug, the more I began to understand that these failures weren't accidents. They were the predictable result of policies designed by people who'd never lived in the communities they were trying to help, implemented by agencies that measured success through spending rather than outcomes, and evaluated by metrics that prioritized political considerations over economic reality. The breakthrough came on Thursday evening when I was cross-referencing employment data with infrastructure spending and noticed a pattern that made my stomach drop. Every major federal investment in rural areas over the past decade had been followed within 2 years by accelerated population decline in the affected communities. The programs designed to save small-town America were actually hastening its demise. I printed out charts and graphs that told the story in stark visual terms, then walked to Dr. Martinez's office without bothering to schedule an appointment. Her assistant tried to intercept me, but I'd learned that urgency opened doors in Washington just as effectively as political connection. "This can't wait," I told her, spreading documents across Dr. Martinez's conference table. "I know why rural development programs fail, and it's worse than we thought." Dr. Martinez looked up from her own work, took one glance at the data I'd laid out, and called her assistant. "Cancel my next 3 meetings and ask Director Harrison to come down here immediately." Director James Harrison ran the Office of Management and Budget's Rural Policy Division, a soft-spoken economist who'd spent 15 years designing programs that I'd just proven were counterproductive. He arrived within 10 minutes, took one look at my analysis, and sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "Walk me through this," he said quietly. I pointed to the first chart, which showed federal infrastructure spending in rural counties over the past decade. "Every time we improve roads or expand broadband in a rural area, we make it easier for people to commute to jobs in larger cities. We're subsidizing the exodus we're trying to prevent." The second chart tracked business development loans alongside population data. "When we help rural entrepreneurs start service businesses, we're creating jobs that depend on local customers, but if the local population is declining, these businesses are doomed from the start. We're setting people up to fail." The third chart was the most damning. "Job retraining programs have successfully moved workers from declining industries into other declining industries. We're not creating economic opportunity, we're just shuffling people between different forms of economic instability." Director Harrison studied the data for several minutes before speaking. "The political implications of this are catastrophic," Dr. Martinez finished. "We've been announcing success stories for programs that are actually making problems worse." I pulled out one final document, a policy proposal I'd been working on since Tuesday, but I think I know how to fix it. The proposal was radical by Washington standards, though it seemed obvious from a Millfield perspective. Instead of trying to transform rural communities into something they weren't, federal policy should focus on stabilizing and strengthening what they already were. Instead of subsidizing population decline through infrastructure improvements that facilitated commuting, investment should focus on local economic development that gave people reasons to stay. The centerpiece was something I called community anchor businesses, federal investment in locally owned enterprises that served regional rather than just local market, manufacturing cooperatives, food processing facilities, technology centers that could serve multiple small towns while remaining rooted in specific communities. "This would require completely restructuring our approach," Director Harrison said after reading through my proposal. "Good," Dr. Martinez replied. "Our current approach isn't working." She stood and gathered the documents I'd prepared. "Madison, I want you to develop this into a full policy framework. James, I want you to model the budget implications. We're briefing the president on Monday." As they prepared to leave, Director Harrison turned back to me. "How long have you been working on rural development policy?" "About a week." He blinked. "And before that?" "I served coffee to people whose lives had been destroyed by rural development policy." After they left, I sat alone in the conference room, staring out at the Washington Monument and trying to process what had just happened. 7 days ago, I'd been worried about paying my electric bill. Now I was designing federal policy that could affect millions of people and restructure billions of dollars in government spending. My phone buzzed with a text message from Brooklyn. "Heard from Mom that you're traveling for work. Didn't know Murphy's Diner had a travel budget. Call me." I deleted the message without responding. Brooklyn's sarcasm felt like a relic from a previous life, but her text reminded me that I hadn't spoken to my family since leaving for Washington. They knew I'd quit the diner and given up my apartment, but I'd been deliberately vague about why. The truth felt too large and too fragile to share over the phone. That evening, I walked back to my temporary housing, a furnished apartment in Georgetown that the White House Travel Office had arranged, and tried to figure out how to explain my new life to people who'd spent 26 years assuming they knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. The answer came to me while I was reviewing job descriptions for the rural development team I'd apparently been tasked with building. If I was going to convince my family that this opportunity was real, I needed to show them rather than tell them. And if I was going to design programs that actually worked, I needed to understand how existing programs had failed in specific communities, rather than just statistical aggregates. I called Dr. Martinez at home, which felt presumptuous until she answered on the first ring. Madison, working late, I need to make a site visit. Back to Ohio, to see how current programs are actually functioning at ground level. But I also need to tell my family what's happening. Killing two birds with one stone. I like it. How long do you need? A long weekend. I can gather data on local program implementation and have conversations that are overdue. Take the time you need. But Madison, her voice became more serious. Be prepared for the possibility that the people who've been underestimating you won't be ready to acknowledge they were wrong. Sometimes the hardest part of changing your life is dealing with people who prefer the old version. Saturday morning, I flew commercial back to Cleveland, then drove a rental car through the countryside that looked different than it had a week earlier. The abandoned factories and struggling farms that had always seemed like inevitable casualties of economic change now looked like policy failures, problems that could be solved rather than tragedies that had to be endured. I'd arranged to meet with 3 local officials who'd administered federal programs in the region: the county economic development director, the community college president who'd overseen job retraining initiatives, and the mayor of Milf, who'd been dealing with population decline for the past decade. The conversations were revelatory. Each official described programs that had looked promising on paper but failed to account for local realities. The economic development director had distributed business loans to entrepreneurs who'd lacked the customer base to sustain their ventures. The community college president had trained workers for jobs that existed primarily in statistical projections rather than actual labor market. The mayor had watched infrastructure improvements facilitate the very population decline they'd been designed to prevent. Federal programs are designed for the America that exists in Washington, the mayor told me over coffee in the same diner where I'd worked for 10 years. They don't account for the America that exists in places like this. But they also shared examples of initiatives that had succeeded, usually through creative interpretation of federal guidelines rather than faithful implementation. A food processing cooperative that had been funded through small business loans, but structured as a community development project. A technology training center that had been established through educational grants, but focused on local entrepreneurship rather than job placement. A housing rehabilitation program that had been designed to improve property values, but had actually helped families stay in the community. The programs that work are the ones where someone local figured out how to make federal money serve community needs rather than federal priorities. The economic development director explained, but that requires local leadership that understands both federal bureaucracy and community dynamics. Most places don't have that. By Sunday afternoon, I had enough data to support my policy recommendations and enough confidence to face my family. I drove to my parents' house, the same 2-story colonial where I'd grown up, with its peeling paint and sagging front porch that my father never seemed to find time to repair. Brooklyn's SUV was parked in the driveway, which meant she'd been called in for whatever conversation was about to happen. I sat in the rental car for several minutes, reviewing the talking points I'd prepared, then decided to trust the training I'd been receiving all week in Washington: be direct, be honest, and be prepared to defend your position with facts. The front door opened before I could knock. My mother stood there wearing the worried expression that had become her default over the past few years, since Dad's unemployment and her own struggles had settled into a pattern of low-level crisis management. "Madison, honey, we've been so worried. Brooklyn said you quit your job and disappeared without telling anyone where you were going." "I'm fine, Mom. Actually, I'm better than fine. Can we sit down? I have some things to tell you." The living room looked exactly as it had when I'd left for Washington: worn furniture, family photos documenting happier times, the general atmosphere of people making do with less than they'd planned. Brooklyn sat on the couch wearing jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than my parents spent on groceries in a month, her expression oscillating between concern and irritation. "So where have you been?" she asked without preamble. "And why are you driving a rental car?" "I've been in Washington, working." "Working where?" I took a breath and decided to start with the basics. "I've been offered a position with the White House Domestic Policy Team, Senior Advisor for Rural Development. I start officially on Monday." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. My father looked confused. My mother looked worried, and Brooklyn looked like she was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "The White House," my father said slowly. "In Washington, D.C. That's the one. Doing what exactly?" "Designing and implementing federal programs to support rural economic development, helping communities like Millfield become more economically stable." Brooklyn leaned forward, her expression shifting from confusion to skepticism. "Madison, that's not a real job. Those positions go to people with decades of experience, advanced degrees, and political connections. You can't just apply for a job at the White House like you're filling out an application at Walmart." "I didn't apply, they recruited me." "Based on what?" I pulled out my phone and showed them the official offer letter, complete with a federal seal and Dr. Martinez's signature. Brooklyn read it twice before handing it back to me. "This has to be some kind of mistake," she said finally, "or a scam. People don't go from serving coffee in Millfield to advising the president in the space of a week. People do when they write policy proposals that solve problems the federal government has been struggling with for decades." My mother spoke for the first time since we'd sat down. "Honey, this sounds wonderful, but are you sure it's legitimate? There are so many scams targeting young people these days." I showed them photos from inside the White House, my temporary identification badge, business cards from Dr. Martinez and Director Harris. The evidence was overwhelming, but I could see that believing it required them to fundamentally revise their understanding of who I was and what I was capable of. "Let's say this is real," Brooklyn said, her tone suggesting she was humoring a delusion. "What makes you think you can handle a job like that? You've never worked in government, never lived in a big city, never dealt with the kind of pressure that comes with positions at that level." The question was fair, but her tone was condescending in a way that reminded me why I'd been reluctant to have this conversation. Brooklyn had spent the past week assuming I'd made another impulsive decision that would end in disappointment and require family intervention. "What makes me qualified," I said carefully, "is that I understand how federal programs fail because I've watched them fail. I know what rural communities need because I've lived in a rural community that hasn't gotten what it needs. I understand the gap between policy intentions and policy outcomes because I've been affected by that gap my entire life. That's not the same as being qualified to design federal policy." Brooklyn sat back, her expression hardening. "Madison, I'm trying to protect you here. This is going to end badly. You're going to get in over your head, fail publicly, and come home with nothing but debt and embarrassment. I've seen this pattern before." "When have you seen this pattern before?" "College applications, job interviews, that internship in Columbus. You get excited about opportunities that are beyond your capabilities, and then you're devastated when reality sets in." The familiar dynamic was reasserting itself. Brooklyn positioning herself as the voice of reason, protecting me from my own naivety. But this time I had documentation that her assessment was wrong. "Brooklyn, I need to tell you something about those situations you mentioned. The college applications, the internship. I didn't fail because I was incapable. I made sacrifices because our family needed me to make sacrifices. There's a difference." "What are you talking about?" I looked at my parents, who were suddenly paying very close attention. "Dad, when you lost your job at the paper mill, how did we keep the house?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Your mother picked up extra shifts at the nursing home, and we cut expenses. And my dinner wage. I was making $400 a week, and I gave you $300 of it for 18 months. The room went quiet again. Brooklyn's expression was shifting from skepticism to something that might have been concerning. "When you got laid off from the auto plant," I continued, "and we thought we might lose the house. Who co-signed the loan modification?" "You did," my father said quietly. Using what collateral? Your college fund. Brooklyn was staring at me now with an expression I couldn't quite read. Madison, I didn't know. You knew. You all knew. You just didn't want to think about it too hard, because it was easier to let me be the responsible one who sacrificed her opportunities, so everyone else could keep theirs. My mother was crying now quietly but visibly. My father was staring at his hands. Brooklyn looked like she was recalculating everything she thought she understood about our family dynamics. The internship in Columbus, I said, my voice steady but firm. I didn't withdraw because I was scared. I withdrew because Mom fell down the stairs and spent 3 days in the hospital, and someone needed to cover her shifts at the nursing home, so we could pay for her medical bills. I was handling that, Brooklyn protested. You were in college, full-time, with a social life, and a boyfriend, and a future that everyone agreed was more important than mine. The silence stretched until my father cleared his throat. Madison, we never asked you to. You didn't have to ask. It was just understood that I was the one who would handle whatever crisis came up, who would put everyone else's needs first, who would make do with less so everyone else could have more. I stood up, suddenly exhausted by the conversation. I'm not angry about it, but I need you to understand that the girl who made those sacrifices isn't the same as a girl who's incapable of handling challenges. I've been handling challenges my entire life. Now I'm finally in a position to handle challenges that might actually make a difference. Brooklyn stood as well, her face flushed. So what? You're just going to abandon your family, move to Washington and pretend you're too important to deal with our problem. I'm going to Washington to design policies that might prevent other families from having to choose between individual opportunity and collective survival. I'm going to try to create options for people who grow up in places like this. And what about us? What about Mom and Dad? I looked at my parents, who were watching this confrontation with expressions of growing alarm. What about you, Brooklyn? You make more money than I ever did at the diner. You have a college degree and professional experience. Why is taking care of Mom and Dad automatically my responsibility instead of ours? The question hung in the air like a challenge no one wanted to accept. Finally, Brooklyn sat back down, her defiance deflating into something that looked like resignation. Because you're better at it than I am, she said quietly. You always have been. Then maybe it's time for you to get better at it. Monday morning arrived with the weight of possibility and the sharp edge of deadline pressure. I sat in the Roosevelt Room at 7:30 a.m., surrounded by policy directors, budget analysts, and senior advisors whose combined experience in Washington probably exceeded my age. In 3 hours I would be briefing the President of the United States on a complete restructuring of federal rural development policy. Dr. Martinez had warned me that presidential briefings were different from policy discussion. You'll have 12 minutes to present your recommendations, 3 minutes for questions, and the rest of your career will be determined by how well you use those 15 minutes. She'd explained over coffee at 6 a.m. The president doesn't need to understand every detail of implementation. He needs to understand the problem, the solution, and why this approach will succeed where others have failed. The briefing materials were spread across the conference table like battle plans, charts showing the correlation between federal investment and population decline, maps highlighting communities where existing programs had backfired, economic projections demonstrating the potential impact of community anchor businesses. But the most important document was a single-page summary that distilled 2 weeks of research into 3 key points. Current programs fail because they treat symptoms rather than causes. Successful rural development requires local ownership rather than federal management. And sustainable economic growth comes from building on existing community strengths, rather than trying to impose external solutions. Director Harrison had been working since midnight to model the budget implications of my proposal. The numbers were staggering. Restructuring rural development programs would require redirecting $47 billion over 5 years, eliminating 17 existing initiatives, and creating 8 new ones. In Washington terms, it was a political earthquake disguised as a policy recommendation. The opposition research on this will be brutal, warned Sarah Chen, the president's chief speechwriter who'd been asked to attend because rural development was likely to feature prominently in upcoming campaign messaging. Every eliminated program has constituencies who'll claim we're abandoning rural America. Every new initiative will be attacked as untested experimentation with taxpayer money. The status quo is untested experimentation with taxpayer money, I replied, pointing to data showing that existing programs had spent $38 billion over the past decade, while rural unemployment had increased and rural population had declined. The difference is that our experiments might actually work. Dr. Martinez checked her watch. We need to walk through the presentation one more time. Madison, remember that the president processes information differently than policy analysts. He thinks in terms of people and stories, not statistics and projections. Lead with human impact, support with data, close with clear action items. I'd been rehearsing this balance for days, trying to find the sweet spot between policy expertise and emotional resonance. The story I'd chosen to lead with was my father's experience with job retraining programs, 3 separate initiatives over 5 years, each one promising to prepare him for stable employment, each one leaving him less employable than before. It was personal enough to illustrate the human cost of policy failure, specific enough to demonstrate my understanding of programmatic problems, and representative enough to justify systemic change. At 10:45 we walked through corridors that had hosted conversations shaping global history. The Oval Office was smaller than it appeared on television but more imposing than any space I'd ever entered. The president sat behind the resolute desk, reviewing briefing materials with the focused intensity of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of lives. "Mr. President," Dr. Martinez began, "this is Madison Thompson, the Rural Development Advisor we discussed." He looked up and extended his hand with the kind of practiced warmth that successful politicians master early in their careers. "Madison, I read your policy brief, impressive work for someone who's been in Washington for 2 weeks. Thank you, though I should mention that I've been studying these issues for 26 years. I just didn't realize it at the time." He smiled at that, settling back in his chair with an expression that suggested genuine interest rather than polite attention. "Walk me through your recommendation." I started with my father's story describing the cycle of retraining and unemployment that had defined his working life since the paper mill closed. The president listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, his expression growing more serious as I detailed the systematic failure of programs designed to help displaced workers. "This pattern isn't unique to my father or my community," I continued, transitioning to the broader data. "Federal rural development programs have consistently produced outcomes opposite to their stated goals, because they're designed by people who view rural communities as problems to be solved, rather than assets to be strengthened." I presented the charts showing correlation between federal investment and population decline, the maps highlighting communities where infrastructure improvements had accelerated economic exit, the analysis demonstrating how business development loans had funded ventures doomed to fail in declining markets. "Current programs treat symptoms rather than causes," I explained, pointing to a graph showing employment trends in rural counties that had received significant federal investment. "We're spending billions of dollars to help communities manage decline instead of investing in initiatives that could reverse decline." The president studied the data for several seconds before speaking. "What's your alternative?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for. "Community anchor businesses. Instead of funding service industries that depend on local customers, we invest in manufacturing cooperatives, food processing facilities, and technology centers that can serve regional markets while remaining rooted in specific community. Instead of training workers for jobs that don't exist, we help communities create businesses that generate employment for existing skills." I outlined the framework I'd developed: federal investment, structured as community partnerships rather than traditional grants, success measured by population retention rather than short-term job creation, program implementation managed by local leadership rather than federal bureaucracy. "The key insight," I concluded, "is that rural communities don't need to be transformed into something they're not. They need support to become sustainable versions of what they already are." Director Harrison presented the budget implications, with the precision of someone who'd spent his career translating policy ideas into fiscal reality. The president asked detailed questions about implementation timelines, political feasibility, and potential unintended consequences. His questions revealed both policy sophistication and political calculation. He understood not just whether the programs might work, but whether they could survive congressional approval and interest group opposition. The political challenge, he said finally, is that this approach requires us to acknowledge that previous administrations, including Democratic administrations, have been throwing money at the wrong problems. That's not a popular message in Washington, but it's an honest message, I replied. And it's a message that rural communities are ready to hear. People in places like Millfield know that federal programs haven't worked. They're not looking for more of the same. They're looking for something different. The president was quiet for nearly a minute, studying documents and considering implications. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decision. I want to pilot this approach in 10 communities over the next 18 months. If the results support your projections, we'll propose the full restructuring as part of next year's budget. He looked directly at me. Madison, I'm putting you in charge of site selection, program design, and implementation oversight. Martinez will provide administrative support, but this is your initiative to manage. The room seemed to shift around me. Pilot program, 10 communities, 18 months, billions of dollars in potential restructuring. My initiative to manage. Mr. President, I'm honored by your confidence, but I should mention that I've never managed a federal program of this scope. Neither had anyone else, until they did. He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. The advantage of being new to Washington is that you haven't learned all the reasons why things can't be done. Sometimes that's exactly what we need. After leaving the Oval Office, I spent the rest of the morning in Dr. Martinez's office, processing what had just happened and beginning to understand the magnitude of responsibility I'd accepted. Pilot programs weren't just policy experiments. They were proof of concept initiatives that could determine the direction of federal spending for decades. You'll need a team, Dr. Martinez explained, pulling out organizational charts and personnel files. Someone with rural development experience, someone who understands federal contracting, someone with community organizing background, and someone who can manage relationships with state and local officials. She handed me a stack of resumes for potential team members, each representing different approaches to rural development work. Academic researchers who'd studied these issues for years, former federal employees who understood bureaucratic processes, nonprofit directors who'd implemented community development programs, and political operatives who specialized in rural outreach. The challenge, Martinez continued, is building a team that combines federal experience with community credibility. Rural residents are skeptical of Washington experts, but federal bureaucrats are skeptical of people without government experience. You need people who can bridge both worlds. I spent the afternoon interviewing potential team members, each conversation revealing different aspects of the challenges ahead. Robert Fielding had spent 15 years with the Department of Agriculture implementing rural development programs, but he approached communities as clients rather than partners. Maria Santos had managed community organizing campaigns in rural California and Texas, but she'd never worked within federal structures. James Mitchell understood federal contracting procedures better than anyone I'd met, but he'd never lived in a community with fewer than 50,000 residents. The breakthrough came during my conversation with Lisa Washington, a former Peace Corps volunteer who'd spent 5 years managing economic development programs in rural Kentucky before earning a master's degree in public administration and joining the Department of Commerce. She understood both community dynamics and federal processes, but more importantly, she understood the cultural barriers that prevented effective collaboration between Washington and rural America. The biggest mistake federal programs make, she explained during our interview, is assuming that rural communities are eager for outside help. In reality, most rural residents have been disappointed by government promises so many times that they approach new initiatives with justified skepticism. Success requires earning trust before implementing programs. How do you earn that trust? By listening instead of lecturing, by asking what communities need instead of telling them what they should want, by hiring locally whenever possible, and making sure that federal investment benefits local people rather than outside contractors. Lisa became my deputy director, with responsibility for community engagement and program implementation. Dr. Fielding joined as policy advisor, bringing federal experience tempered by my requirement that he spend time in each pilot community before designing programs. Maria Santos became our community organizing specialist, with authority to modify federal procedures when they conflicted with local needs. James Mitchell handled contracts and compliance, but only after agreeing that bureaucratic convenience would never override community benefit. Building the team took 2 weeks and required approval from 7 different federal agencies. But by early December, I had 4 people who shared a commitment to changing how Washington worked with rural America. Our first task was selecting the 10 pilot communities where we'd test community anchor business development. The selection criteria were both political and practical. Communities needed to be struggling economically but not completely devastated, small enough to see measurable impact from federal investment, but large enough to sustain anchor businesses, politically diverse enough to demonstrate bipartisan appeal, but unified enough to support collaborative planning. Lisa and I spent a week driving through Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, visiting communities that met our demographic criteria and evaluating their readiness for partnership with federal programs. The conversations were revealing in ways I hadn't expected. Town after town had been burned by previous federal initiatives that had promised transformation but delivered disappointment. In Riverside, Pennsylvania, a former steel town of 4,000 residents, the mayor showed us an empty building that had been purchased with federal economic development grants to house a technology training center. The center had operated for 18 months before closing when the promised employer partnerships failed to materialize. The building now sat vacant, its windows covered with plywood, a monument to good intentions and poor planning. Federal programs come through here every few years, the mayor explained as we stood in the empty parking lot. They promise jobs, they promise investment, they promise change. Then they disappear, and we're left with debt and empty buildings and people who trusted the government one more time. What would it take for you to trust another federal initiative? He was quiet for a long moment, studying the abandoned building. Proof that this time is different. Proof that Washington understands the difference between helping a community and helping yourselves to good publicity. In Millbrook, West Virginia, a former mining town where unemployment had reached 18%, the conversation was even more direct. The city council met us in a conference room that doubled as a food pantry, its walls lined with shelves of canned goods and boxes of clothing donated by churches from more prosperous areas. "What makes you think your program will work where others have failed?" asked Council Member Janet Rogers, a retired teacher whose directness reminded me of conversations at Murphy's Diner. "Because we're designing programs with communities instead of for communities," I replied. "Because we're measuring success by whether people can stay in their hometowns, not whether they're forced to leave for opportunities elsewhere. And because," Lisa added, "we're committed to hiring locally and buying locally whenever possible. Federal investment should strengthen local economies, not subsidize outside contractors." The council members exchanged glances that suggested cautious interest rather than immediate skepticism. Progress. By the end of the week, we'd identified 12 potential pilot communities and established selection criteria that prioritized community readiness over political consideration. The final 10 would be chosen based on local leadership capacity, economic diversification potential, and commitment to collaborative planning. But the real breakthrough came during our final stop in Millfield, Ohio, where I'd arranged to meet with the mayor and economic development director to discuss my hometown's potential participation in the pilot program. The conversation took place in the same conference room where I'd interviewed for my first job at Murphy's Diner 10 years earlier, but the power dynamic had shifted in ways that still felt surreal. "Madison," the mayor said as we reviewed program requirements, "I have to. A month ago, you were serving coffee at Murphy's, now you're designing federal policy and offering us potentially millions in development funding. How do we know this is legitimate?" I pulled out my federal identification badge, my business cards from the White House, and documentation of the pilot program budget allocation. But the real answer was simpler. Because I know exactly what doesn't work, and I know exactly what this community needs. Because I understand the difference between programs that look good in Washington and programs that actually help people in places like this. The economic development director leaned forward. "What kind of anchor business would you envision for MILF?" I'd been thinking about this question for weeks. Food processing cooperative. We're surrounded by farms that struggle to get their products to market profitably. A community-owned processing facility could serve agricultural producers within a 50-mile radius, while creating stable employment for local residents. How many jobs? Initially, about 40 full-time positions. Within 3 years, potentially 80 to 100. But more importantly, it would create a market for local agricultural products, which means indirect economic impact for farming families throughout the region. The mayor and economic development director spent the next hour asking detailed questions about implementation timelines, community investment requirements, and federal oversight procedure. Their questions revealed both interest and wariness. They wanted to believe that this opportunity was real, but they'd been disappointed too many times to accept promises without scrutiny. If Millfield participates in this pilot program, the mayor said finally, and if it succeeds, what happens next? If it succeeds, we scale it nationally. If it fails, we figure out why and design something better. And if it fails, what happens to our community investment? The federal government absorbs the financial risk. Community investment is limited to time, planning, participation, and commitment to collaborative implementation. They agreed to submit an application for pilot program participation, with the understanding that final selection would be based on community planning capacity rather than political connection. After they left, I sat alone in the conference room where I'd once hoped for a job that paid $8 an hour, now responsible for programs that could reshape rural economic development across the country. The transformation felt too rapid and too complete to be real, but the documents in my briefcase proved otherwise. In 6 weeks, I'd gone from serving coffee to designing federal policy, from being dismissed by my own family to briefing the president, from having no prospects beyond Millfield to overseeing initiatives that could affect millions of rural Americans. But with opportunity came responsibility that kept me awake at night. 10 communities would trust us with their economic futures. Hundreds of families would make decisions based on our promises. Thousands of federal employees would implement programs I'd designed. If we succeeded, rural development policy could be transformed for generations. If we failed, we'd become another example of Washington's disconnection from the communities it claimed to serve. The stakes were too high for failure, but they were also too high for anything less than complete commitment. Everything I'd learned growing up in a struggling community, everything I'd observed about why federal programs failed, everything I'd discovered about what rural Americans actually needed, it all came down to the next 18 months. As I drove back to Washington that evening, passing through small towns that looked like Millfield, I realized that my sister had been wrong about more than my capability. She'd claimed I'd never leave Millfield, but the truth was more complex. I'd taken Millfield with me, and now I was bringing Washington's resources back to places that had been forgotten for too long. The girl who'd accepted limitations imposed by others was gone. The woman driving toward the capital carrying responsibility for rural communities across America was someone neither my family nor I had imagined possible, but she was real, and she had work to do. 3 months into the pilot program, the first cracks in Washington's facade began to show. I was reviewing quarterly implementation reports when Dr. Martinez knocked on my office door with an expression that had become familiar over the winter. The careful neutrality of someone delivering news that would complicate my day considerably. "We have a problem," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the weight of someone who'd been managing political crises longer than I'd been alive. "Actually, we have several problems, but one of them requires immediate attention." She handed me a folder marked Confidential Executive Review Only, that contained documents I'd never seen before, internal memos from the Department of Agriculture, questioning the legal authority for community anchor business funding, budget projections from the Office of Management and Budget suggesting that pilot program costs were exceeding projections, and most concerning, a preliminary report from the Government Accountability Office, raising questions about the competitive bidding processes we'd implemented to prioritize local contractors. "How long has this been circulated?" I asked, scanning through criticisms that felt both technically accurate and fundamentally misguided. 2 weeks, long enough for your opponents to build a comprehensive case against continuation of the pilot program." "My opponents?" Dr. Nez pulled out a second folder, this one containing screenshots of social media posts, newspaper articles, and cable news segments that painted a picture of coordinated opposition I hadn't realized was forming. The narrative was consistent across platforms. Inexperienced advisor implements experimental programs with taxpayer money, bypasses established procedures to benefit political allies, wastes federal resources on unproven initiatives that contradict decades of rural development expertise. The most damaging piece was an op-ed in the Washington Post written by Dr. Caroline Westfield, a Georgetown professor, who'd designed many of the existing rural development programs my initiatives were replacing. She argued that community anchor businesses were well-intentioned, but naive attempts to reverse economic trends that reflect global market realities rather than policy failures. She makes valid points about market forces, Martinez said carefully, but she's also protecting programs she spent her career developing. The criticism isn't entirely objective. I read through Dr. Westfield's op-ed twice, noting how she'd managed to criticize my proposals without directly attacking my qualifications, focusing instead on policy disagreements that sounded reasonable to readers unfamiliar with implementation reality. It was sophisticated political opposition disguised as academic analysis. What's the timeline for response? Congressional hearings are scheduled for next month. The House Subcommittee on Rural Development wants testimony about pilot program management, budget oversight, and preliminary results. You'll be the primary witness. Congressional hearings, testimony, under oath. Questions from representatives who'd already formed opinions based on incomplete information and political considerations. I'd watched enough C-SPAN to understand that congressional hearings were often more about generating soundbites than gathering information. Who else is testifying? Dr. Westfield for one, Director Harrison from OMB, someone from the GAO who wrote the preliminary report, and 3 rural mayors, 2 supporting the program, 1 opposing it. I set down the folder and tried to process the political dynamics at play. In 6 months, I'd gone from complete obscurity to congressional testimony, from serving coffee to defending federal policy in front of cameras that would broadcast my answers to millions of Americans. The transition felt both inevitable and impossible. What's the best-case scenario for these hearings? You present compelling evidence that pilot programs are working, demonstrate proper fiscal management, and convince enough subcommittee members that the approach deserves continued funding. And worst case, program termination, investigation into your hiring process, and enough political damage to end your career in Washington before it really begins. The weight of responsibility had been manageable when it focused on policy design and program implementation, but the realization that my personal credibility would determine the fate of initiatives affecting thousands of families in 10 communities created pressure that felt almost physical. If I failed in front of Congress, I wouldn't just be disappointing my own ambitions, I'd be betraying communities that had trusted federal promises one more time. That afternoon, I drove to Millfield to check on the food processing cooperative that had become the flagship project of our pilot program. The transformation over 3 months had been remarkable. A defunct factory building renovated into modern processing facility. 18 local residents hired for full-time positions. Contracts signed with 47 area farms to process everything from corn and soybeans to specialty vegetables and organic beef. But the real measure of success was visible in conversations with people whose lives had been changed by stable employment in a community where stable employment had become rare. Jennifer Walsh, a single mother who'd been working 2 part-time jobs to support her family, now earned enough from her position as a quality control supervisor to afford consistent childcare and start saving for her daughter's college education. Before this job, I was always one crisis away from disaster, she told me as we toured the processing floor. Car repair, medical bill, anything unexpected would put me behind on rent. Now I can plan more than a month ahead. Marcus Peterson, a former auto worker who'd been unemployed for 8 months before joining the cooperative, had progressed from line worker to shift supervisor in 10 weeks. His salary was lower than his previous manufacturing job, but the cooperative's profit-sharing structure meant his income would increase as the business grew. The difference, he explained, is that I'm not just working for someone else's profit. When we succeed, Everyone who works here succeeds. When we find new markets or improve efficiency, we all benefit. The cooperative's general manager, Sarah Kim, was an agricultural business graduate from Ohio State, who'd returned to rural Ohio specifically to run community-owned enterprises. Her combination of technical expertise and local commitment represented exactly the kind of leadership that successful anchor businesses required. The challenges have been significant, she admitted as we reviewed quarterly financial. Learning to operate as a cooperative, rather than a traditional business, requires different decision-making processes, different financial management, and different relationships with workers, but the benefits are becoming clear. Employee turnover is essentially zero, productivity per worker is higher than industry averages, and community support for the business has exceeded all expectations. The numbers supported her assessment. The cooperative had processed 2.3 million pounds of agricultural products in its first quarter, generating $807,000 in revenue while paying $312,000 in wages to local employees. More importantly, area farms were reporting increased income from direct sales to the cooperative, rather than commodity markets that offered lower prices and less predictable demand. But the visit also revealed challenges that congressional testimony would need to address. Initial startup costs had exceeded projections by 18%, largely due to building renovations that uncovered environmental issues not identified during initial inspection. Equipment purchases had required modifications to accommodate smaller-scale processing than manufacturers typically designed for. Training workers with limited technical background had taken longer than originally scheduled. These weren't failures, but they represented the kind of cost overruns and timeline delays that opponents could characterize as evidence of poor planning and unrealistic expectations. Congressional hearings would require me to defend not just the overall approach, but specific decisions made under pressure with incomplete information. That evening, I met with Brooklyn for the first time since returning to Washington. She'd requested the meeting through our mother, claiming she wanted to understand what I was actually doing and apologize for her previous skepticism. We met at a restaurant in downtown Columbus, neutral territory that felt safer than family homes loaded with decades of complicated history. Brooklyn looked different than she had 3 months earlier, less polished, more tired, the kind of subtle changes that suggested stress she was trying to hide. Her SUV in the parking lot had a dent in the rear bumper that hadn't been repaired, and her purse was a practical bag rather than the designer accessories she usually carried. "I've been reading about your congressional hearings," she said after we'd ordered, her tone carefully neutral. "Sounds like you're facing some serious opposition." "Opposition comes with the territory when you're trying to change how things work. Madison, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you respond." The seriousness in her voice was unusual. Brooklyn typically approached difficult conversations with defensive humor or indirect criticism. Direct acknowledgement of tension was new territory for both of us. "I was wrong about you, about your capabilities, about your prospects, about what you could accomplish. I was also wrong about my motivations for discouraging you." She paused, staring at her water glass rather than meeting my eyes. "I told myself I was protecting you from disappointment, but the truth is that I was protecting myself from having to confront my own limitations. It was easier to keep you in a supporting role than to acknowledge that you might be more ambitious and more capable than I was." The admission felt both overdue and unexpected. I'd anticipated that success in Washington might change how my family viewed me, but I hadn't expected Brooklyn to articulate the psychological dynamics that had shaped our relationship for decades. "The bank is laying off half the staff next month," she continued. "Automation and consolidation. My position is being eliminated, along with most of the other local jobs. I'll probably have to move to Cleveland or Columbus to find comparable work. I'm sorry. I know how much that job meant to you." The job was never what it meant to me. It was what it represented: stability, respectability, proof that I'd made something of myself despite growing up in a place where opportunities were limited. "Losing it feels like losing my identity." She finally looked up, her expression more vulnerable than I'd seen since we were children. "What you've accomplished, what you're doing in Washington, it's exactly what I always told myself I wanted but was too afraid to pursue. You took risks I was afraid to take, and you succeeded in ways I was afraid to attempt. Brooklyn, you can still." "I'm not asking for advice or encouragement, I'm apologizing for the reference call to Ohio State, for trying to undermine your confidence, for treating your dreams like threats to my security. You deserved better from me, especially when you were sacrificing your opportunities to support our family. The conversation continued for another hour, covering territory we'd never explored, the pressure she'd felt as the older sister expected to succeed first, the resentment she'd harbored about my academic abilities, the fear that my achievements would highlight her own limitations. It was painful and necessary, the kind of honesty that might have prevented years of undermining if we'd found the courage for it earlier. When we parted, Brooklyn handed me an envelope, character reference for your congressional testimony, detailed, honest, focused on your qualifications and accomplishments. I know it doesn't undo the damage I caused, but maybe it helps with what you're facing now. The letter was 3 pages long, typed on professional letterhead from the bank, documenting my academic achievements, community involvement, and family sacrifices, with the thoroughness of someone who'd been paying attention even when she'd been acting destructive. It read like testimony from someone who understood both my capabilities and my character, written by someone who regretted not recognizing both sooner. Back in Washington, I spent the following week preparing for congressional testimony with the intensity of someone whose career would be determined by 15 minutes of televised questions. Dr. Martinez arranged practice sessions with former congressional staff, who specialized in preparing witnesses for hostile questioning, communications experts, who taught me how to deliver complex policy information in soundbite form, and political advisors who helped me understand the subcommittee members' likely motivations and pressure points. The preparation was grueling. Practice sessions involved rapid-fire questions designed to fluster and trap witnesses, aggressive interruptions that made coherent responses nearly impossible, and hypothetical scenarios that forced me to defend decisions I'd never made, under circumstances that didn't exist. After the 3rd session, I understood why congressional testimony was considered one of the most challenging aspects of federal service. The key, explained Janet Morrison, a former subcommittee staff director who'd been hired to coach my responses, is remembering that congressional hearings aren't actually about gathering information. They're about creating moments that support predetermined narrative. Your job isn't to educate subcommittee members, it's to avoid giving them opportunities to mischaracterize your work. How do I do that? Stick to facts, avoid speculation, acknowledge limitations without undermining your overall argument, and never let them bait you into defensive responses that sound evasive or arrogant. The practice sessions revealed gaps in my preparation that could prove embarrassing under congressional questioning. I'd focused on policy development and implementation management, but I hadn't memorized budget details that representatives might demand on the spot. I understood community impacts in broad terms, but I couldn't cite specific employment numbers or revenue figures for individual businesses. I believed in the pilot program's approach, but I struggled to articulate why it deserved continuation without definitive proof of long-term success. Lisa Washington spent 2 days drilling me on financial details until I could recite budget allocations, cost overruns, and projected savings for each pilot community. Maria Santos helped me develop talking points that connected policy abstractions to specific families whose lives had been improved by anchor business employment. Dr. Fielding coached me on technical aspects of rural development programming that representatives with agricultural districts would understand. But the most valuable preparation came from an unexpected source: a conference call with mayors from all 10 pilot communities, each of whom shared their perspective on what federal testimony should emphasize. Their advice was both practical and personal: focus on measurable outcomes rather than theoretical projections, acknowledge challenges without apologizing for innovation, and remember that successful pilot programs would benefit thousands of communities beyond the 10 currently participating. Madison, said Mayor Janet Rogers from Millbrook, West Virginia, you're not just defending your career up there, you're defending the possibility that federal programs can actually help places like ours instead of just managing our decline. Don't let them turn that into something you should be ashamed of. The night before the hearing, I sat in my Georgetown apartment reviewing testimony that had been refined through dozens of drafts and practice sessions. The opening statement was 4 pages long, carefully crafted to present pilot program achievements, acknowledge implementation challenges, and request continued funding based on preliminary evidence of success. But the real test wouldn't be the prepared statement, it would be the questions that followed, the rapid-fire challenges designed to expose weaknesses in logic or gaps in knowledge, the attempts to trap me into admissions that could be used to justify program termination. I called my parents to let them know the hearing would be broadcast live on C-SPAN, warned them that congressional questioning could be aggressive and personal, and asked them not to take anything said about my qualifications or judgment as a reflection of how they'd raised me. "Honey," my mother said, "we'll be proud of you no matter what happens tomorrow. You've already accomplished more than we ever imagined possible." My father was more direct. "You've got this, Madison. You understand these issues better than anyone in that room, and you've got results to prove it. Don't let them intimidate you into forgetting that." As I prepared for bed, I reviewed the documents that would accompany my testimony: employment statistics from pilot communities, financial reports showing proper management of federal funds, letters of support from local officials, and photographs documenting physical improvements in anchor business facilities. The evidence was compelling, but congressional hearings weren't decided by evidence alone. They were political theater where facts competed with narratives, where personality and presentation could matter as much as policy substance, where a single unfortunate phrase could overshadow hours of substantive discussion. Tomorrow would determine whether the pilot program continued for its planned 18-month timeline, or ended after 6 months as a cautionary tale about inexperienced advisors implementing untested initiatives. It would determine whether community anchor businesses became a model for rural development nationwide or remained a footnote in federal policy experimentation. But more than that, it would determine whether someone like me, someone from a place like Millfield, with experience like mine, could succeed in Washington, when success required not just policy expertise, but political survival skills that no one had taught me and I'd had no time to develop. The stakes were clear, the preparation was complete, the outcome was beyond my control. All that remained was to show up, tell the truth, and trust that the work spoke for itself. The Hart Senate office building felt like a cathedral designed to intimidate rather than inspire. I walked through corridors lined with marble columns and historical portraits, following Agent Caldwell toward a hearing room where my career would either be validated or terminated in front of C-SPAN cameras that would broadcast every moment of congressional theater to anyone interested in watching federal policy debates on a Tuesday morning. The hearing room was smaller than it appeared on television, but more formal than any space I'd occupied before accepting this position. Witness tables faced a curved dais where subcommittee members sat like judges presiding over trials that determined guilt or innocence based on political calculations rather than legal evidence. Camera crews positioned themselves to capture the most dramatic angles of confrontation, while reporters filled gallery seats with notebooks and laptops ready to live-tweet soundbites that would define public perception of everything I'd worked to accomplish. Westfield arrived precisely on time, wearing a navy suit that projected academic authority and carrying a briefcase that probably contained decades of research supporting existing rural development approaches. She nodded politely in my direction without making eye contact, the professional courtesy of someone who understood that we were adversaries despite sharing policy interests. Chairman Robert Hayes, a Republican from Iowa whose district included several struggling farming communities, called the hearing to order with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested he'd presided over hundreds of these sessions. His opening statement framed the proceedings as oversight of taxpayer spending rather than evaluation of policy innovation, immediately establishing a tone that favored criticism over analysis. The purpose of today's hearing, he announced, is to examine the management and effectiveness of experimental rural development programs implemented by the current administration. These programs represent significant departures from established approaches, and Congress has a responsibility to ensure that taxpayer funds are being used responsibly and effectively. Ranking Member Sarah Martinez, a Democrat from California, offered a more supportive framing. Rural communities across America have been struggling for decades despite substantial federal investment. If traditional approaches were working, we wouldn't need to consider alternatives. Today's hearing should evaluate whether new approaches offer better prospects for sustainable rural development. The political battle lines were drawn before anyone had presented evidence. Westfield testified first, delivering a polished presentation that criticized community anchor businesses as economically naive attempts to reverse market forces through federal subsidy. Her argument was sophisticated and data-driven. Global economic trends favored urban concentration and industrial efficiency. Rural population decline reflected rational responses to economic opportunity, and federal programs should help people adapt to economic reality rather than fight against it. Community anchor businesses, she concluded, represent well-intentioned but ultimately futile attempts to preserve economic arrangements that global markets have rendered obsolete. Federal resources would be better spent helping rural residents transition to opportunities in metropolitan areas rather than subsidizing businesses that cannot compete effectively in modern markets. Her testimony was followed by Director Harrison's presentation of budget data, showing that pilot program costs had exceeded initial projections by an average of 22% across all 10 communities. The overruns weren't dramatic by federal standards, but they provided ammunition for representatives who wanted to characterize the programs as fiscally irresponsible. Mayor Janet Rogers from Millbrook testified in support of the anchor business approach, describing how the community's new furniture manufacturing cooperative had created 37 jobs in 6 months, while generating contracts with regional retailers that brought outside revenue into the local economy. Her testimony was heartfelt and specific, but lacked the policy sophistication that congressional subcommittees typically found convincing. Then, it was my turn. I approached the witness table with testimony that had been refined through dozens of practice sessions, but also with confidence that came from 6 months of implementation experience rather than theoretical analysis. The opening statement took 4 minutes to deliver, but each sentence had been crafted to address specific criticisms, while building toward a comprehensive defense of community anchor businesses as a sustainable rural development strategy. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Martinez, distinguished members of the subcommittee, I began. I appear before you today not as a Washington expert or academic theorist, but as someone who grew up watching federal rural development programs fail in my hometown and who has spent the past 6 months implementing an approach designed to address those failures systematically. I outlined the pilot program's achievements: 37 new jobs created across 10 communities, $12.7 million in private investment leveraged by federal funding, 89 local businesses reporting increased revenue from anchor business partnerships, and population decline slowed or reversed in 7 of the 10 pilot communities. But I also acknowledged the implementation challenges: cost overruns that reflected the complexity of renovating abandoned industrial facilities, timeline delays caused by environmental issues not anticipated during initial planning, and learning curves associated with training workers for technical positions that hadn't existed in these communities for decades. These challenges, I explained, represent the difference between theoretical policy design and practical implementation. They don't indicate program failure, they indicate the kind of adaptive management that successful initiatives require. Chairman Hayes began the questioning with obvious skepticism. Ms. Thompson, you've been in your position for 6 months. Westfield has been studying rural development for 20 years. What qualifies you to contradict her assessment of economic realities? Mr. Chairman, Dr. Westfield's research focuses on aggregate economic trends and statistical analysis. My work focuses on specific communities and individual families. Both perspectives are valuable, but they lead to different conclusions about what constitutes success. Can you elaborate? Dr. Westfield's data shows that rural population decline reflects rational economic choices. My data shows that those choices often result from limited options rather than abundant opportunities. When we create local economic opportunities that allow people to stay in their communities while earning stable incomes, population decline slows. That suggests the problem isn't irreversible economic trends, it's insufficient economic development. Representative Michael Chen from Texas, whose district included several rural counties, pressed me on budget management. These cost overruns suggest poor planning and fiscal irresponsibility. How do you justify spending 22% more than projected? Representative Chen, initial cost projections were based on available data about building conditions and equipment requirements. When we discovered asbestos in buildings that hadn't been occupied for a decade, or when we found that standard food processing equipment needed modification for smaller-scale operations, we faced a choice: abandon the projects or invest additional resources to address unexpected challenges. Why not abandon projects that proved more expensive than anticipated? Because the communities we're serving have been abandoned by federal programs too many times already. When we make commitments to rural communities, we need to follow through even when implementation proves more complex than planning anticipated. The questioning continued for 90 minutes, covering everything from legal authority for cooperative development funding to competitive bidding procedures for equipment purchases. Some representatives seemed genuinely interested in understanding how the programs worked. Others appeared focused on finding statements they could use to justify predetermined conclusions. The breakthrough moment came during an exchange with Representative Lisa Morrison from Ohio, whose district included 3 pilot communities. She asked about employment outcomes for workers who'd been displaced from previous jobs. Representative Morrison: "I'd like to share a specific example. Marcus Peterson worked at the Ford plant in Millfield until it closed in 20. He was unemployed for 8 months before joining the food processing cooperative we established there. His starting salary was lower than his previous manufacturing job, but the cooperative's profit-sharing structure means his income increases as the business grows. More importantly, he didn't have to leave Millfield to find stable employment." What's his current salary compared to his previous job? Currently about 85% of his previous wage, but projected income for next year based on business growth and profit sharing should exceed his previous salary. And he's building ownership equity in a community business rather than just working for an external corporation. That's a concrete example of federal investment creating sustainable local employment rather than temporary assistance. Exactly. And it illustrates why anchor businesses represent a different approach from traditional rural development. Instead of training workers for jobs that don't exist locally, we're creating businesses that provide stable employment while serving regional markets. Representative Morrison's follow-up questions allowed me to detail similar success stories from other pilot communities, demonstrating that the Millfield example wasn't isolated, but representative of systematic results. The most hostile questioning came from Representative David Walsh from North Carolina, who seemed determined to characterize me as an unqualified outsider implementing experimental programs with taxpayer money. "Ms. Thompson, 6 months ago you were working as a waitress. What possible experience qualifies you to manage federal programs affecting rural communities across multiple states?" The question was designed to embarrass me, but it also provided an opportunity I'd been preparing for since my first day in Washington. Representative Walsh: "6 months ago I was working as a waitress in a rural community that had been failed by federal programs for 2 decades. I watched my father go through 3 different job retraining programs that prepared him for positions that didn't exist. I saw infrastructure investments that made it easier for people to leave our community rather than stay. I experienced the gap between policy intentions and policy outcomes firsthand. That's not the same as being qualified to design federal policy." Representative Walsh: "I would argue that it's exactly what qualifies me to design federal policy. The people who designed previous rural development programs had impressive credentials and extensive experience, but they'd never lived in communities affected by those programs. They understood economic theory but not economic reality. They could model statistical outcomes, but not individual impacts." Are you saying that academic expertise is irrelevant to policy development? I'm saying that academic expertise without implementation experience produces programs that look sophisticated in Washington but fail when they encounter real communities with specific challenges and limited resources. Representative Walsh's expressions suggested he hadn't expected me to turn his attack into a defense of practical experience over theoretical credentials. His follow-up questions became increasingly specific and technical, apparently designed to expose gaps in my knowledge. But 6 months of intensive preparation had equipped me to discuss budget procedures, federal contracting requirements, and interagency coordination processes with the precision of someone who'd been managing them daily. The hearing's climax came during closing statements, when Chairman Hayes asked each witness to summarize their position in 2 minutes. Westfield reiterated her argument that anchor businesses couldn't succeed against global economic forces, that federal investment would be better spent helping rural residents relocate to metropolitan areas with greater opportunities. I took a different approach, Ms. Chairman. 6 months ago, my sister told me I'd never leave our hometown because I wasn't capable of succeeding anywhere else. She was wrong about my capabilities, but she was also wrong about what leaving meant. I didn't leave Millfield to escape rural America. I left to bring resources back to rural America. The pilot programs we've implemented represent that same principle applied to federal policy. Instead of helping rural communities manage decline, we're helping them build sustainable economic futures. Instead of training workers for jobs in distant cities, we're creating businesses that provide local employment, serving regional markets. Dr. Westfield argues that global economic trends make rural communities obsolete. I argue that global economic trends make local economic development more important than ever. When communities have anchor businesses that serve regional markets, while providing local employment, they become less vulnerable to global economic disruptions rather than more vulnerable. The choice facing this subcommittee isn't between experimental programs and proven approaches. It's between federal policies that accelerate rural decline and federal policies that reverse rural decline. The pilot programs have demonstrated that reversal is possible when federal investment supports community ownership rather than external extraction. I urge you to continue funding these initiatives not because they represent perfect solutions, but because they represent the kind of innovative approaches that rural America deserves after decades of policy failure. Chairman Hayes gave the hearing to a close without indicating how the subcommittee would vote on continued funding. The political calculation would happen behind closed doors over the following weeks, influenced by factors that had little to do with testimony or evidence. But as I gathered my materials and prepared to leave, Representative Morrison approached the witness table. Ms. Thompson, that was exceptional testimony. You defended your work without attacking your critics, acknowledged limitations without undermining your arguments, and demonstrated exactly the kind of practical expertise that federal policymaking needs more of. Dr. Westfield overheard the comment and approached as well. I disagree with your policy recommendations, she said, but I respect how you presented them. You've clearly thought deeply about these issues. Walking out of the Hart building, I felt the peculiar exhaustion that comes from intense public performance under hostile circumstances. I'd answered every question, defended every decision, and presented evidence supporting continued program funding. Whether that would translate into political support remained to be seen. 3 weeks later, I received a call from Dr. Martinez that changed everything again. Madison, I need you in my office immediately, and bring champagne. I found her standing behind her desk with a document bearing congressional letterhead and enough signatures to suggest broad bipartisan support. The subcommittee had voted to not only continue pilot program funding, but to expand it to 30 additional communities over the next 3 years. More significantly, they'd authorized development of legislation that would restructure federal rural development programming along the lines I'd proposed. How did this happen? Your testimony convinced 3 Republican subcommittee members that anchor businesses represent conservative economic principles rather than liberal social engineering, community ownership, local entrepreneurship, reduced dependence on federal assistance. They decided those were their ideas all along. The political irony was delicious, but the policy implications were transformative. Instead of managing a 6-month pilot program affecting 10 communities, I'd be overseeing a 3-year initiative that could reshape rural economic development across 40 states. There's one more thing, Dr. Martinez added, handing me a second document. The president wants to announce the program expansion during his State of the Union address next month. You'll be sitting in the gallery as his special guest. State of the Union, presidential recognition. A national television audience watching a former diner waitress from Millfield, Ohio, represent a new approach to federal rural development policy. 2 days later, I drove back to Millfield for the first time since congressional testimony. The visit was partly personal. I wanted to share the news with my family, but mostly professional. The food processing cooperative had become a model for anchor business development, and delegations from other rural communities were visiting regularly to understand how federal partnership could support local economic development. The transformation in my hometown had accelerated during the months I'd been focused on Washington politics. The cooperative now employed 43 people, and was planning expansion that would add 20 additional positions by summer. More importantly, 3 other businesses had opened in downtown Millfield specifically to serve cooperative employees and their families: a childcare center, a small restaurant, and a hardware store that had reopened after being closed for 2 years. "It's like the town is waking up," explained Sarah Kim, the cooperative's general manager, as we toured facilities that buzzed with activity that had been absent from Millfield for a decade. "People are staying instead of leaving, spending money locally instead of driving to the mall, talking about the future instead of just managing decline." But the real validation came from conversations with families whose lives had been changed by stable local employment. Jennifer Walsh, the single mother who'd progressed from part-time work to quality control supervisor, had enrolled in online business courses with the goal of eventually managing her own anchor business in another community. "This job didn't just give me income," she explained. "It gave me a future I can plan for instead of just reacting to whatever crisis comes next." Marcus Peterson had been elected to the cooperative's board of directors, representing worker interests in business planning decisions that would affect the entire community. His transformation from unemployed factory worker to community business leader illustrated exactly the kind of leadership development that anchor businesses were designed to foster. "The difference between this job and previous jobs," he said, "is that I'm building something instead of just working for something. When the cooperative succeeds, my family succeeds. When my community benefits, I benefit. It's a completely different relationship with work." That evening, I had dinner with my parents in Brooklyn at the same restaurant where we'd had our confrontational conversations 6 months earlier. The dynamic had shifted in ways that still felt surreal. Instead of defending my decisions, I was sharing achievements that none of us had imagined possible. "When you were growing up," my father said, "I always knew you were smart and determined, but I never imagined you'd be designing federal policy or sitting in the gallery during presidential speeches. I never imagined it either. 6 months ago, I was worried about paying my electric bill." Brooklyn had been unusually quiet during dinner, but as we prepared to leave, she asked to speak with me privately. "Madison, I need to tell you something I should have said months ago. I'm proud of you, not just for what you've accomplished professionally, but for how you've handled success. You could have used your position to settle scores or prove points about our family dynamics. Instead, you've focused on helping people who are facing the same challenges we grew up with. Those challenges shaped everything about how I approach this work. I know, and I'm grateful that you turned our family's struggles into something that benefits other families. That takes a kind of character I'm not sure I have." "Brooklyn, you do have that character. You just haven't been in a position to use it yet." "Maybe, but watching what you've done has taught me something important about the difference between reacting to circumstances and creating opportunities. I've been reacting my entire adult life. You've been creating opportunities, even when you didn't realize that's what you were doing." 6 weeks later, I sat in the House gallery during the State of the Union address, wearing a navy suit that Dr. Martinez had helped me select and carrying confidence that came from 6 months of evidence that small-town America could be revitalized through federal policies designed by people who understood small-town America. When the president mentioned rural development initiatives during his speech, cameras found me in the gallery, broadcasting my image to millions of Americans who were learning for the first time about community anchor businesses and federal policies designed to reverse rural decline rather than manage it. "America's rural communities have been struggling for too long," the president said, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "But in places like Millfield, Ohio, we're proving that innovative federal partnerships can create sustainable local employment, reverse population decline, and strengthen communities that are essential to our national character." The applause was bipartisan and sustained, suggesting that rural development had become one of the few policy areas where Republicans and Democrats could find common ground. After the speech, I was invited to a White House reception where members of Congress, cabinet officials, and foreign diplomats discussed the president's agenda for the coming year. The conversations were simultaneously surreal and natural. Surreal because 6 months earlier I couldn't have imagined participating in that. Natural because policy discussions felt like extensions of conversations I'd been having my entire life about how communities could be strengthened rather than abandoned. The most meaningful moment came during a conversation with Senator Patricia Williams from West Virginia, whose state included 3 of the original pilot communities. Ms. Thompson, I represent rural communities that have been written off by federal policy for decades. Your anchor business approach is the first federal initiative I've seen that actually understands what these communities need, rather than what Washington thinks they should want. Senator, the approach works because it's based on listening to communities rather than lecturing them. Federal programs fail when they're designed by people who view rural America as a problem to be solved rather than an asset to be strengthened. Exactly, and that's why I'm introducing legislation to expand anchor business development to every state in the country. Rural America deserves federal policies designed by people who understand rural America. The legislation passed 8 months later with overwhelming bipartisan support, establishing community anchor businesses as the centerpiece of federal rural development policy for the next decade. The bill authorized $50 billion in federal investment over 5 years, created regional development councils managed by rural residents rather than federal bureaucrats, and established performance metrics based on communities' sustainability rather than short-term employment statistics. 2 years after walking into the White House as an unknown diner waitress with a policy brief, I testified before congressional subcommittees as a recognized expert on rural economic development, served on presidential commissions examining federal-local partnerships, and received invitations to speak at universities where professors taught courses based on programs I'd designed. But the most satisfying recognition came from places like Millfield, where anchor businesses had created sustainable employment for hundreds of families while generating economic activity that supported dozens of additional local businesses. The model had been replicated in 127 communities across 38 states, creating more than 8,000 jobs, while leveraging private investment that multiplied federal resources by a factor of 4. The success wasn't just statistical, it was visible in the faces of people like Marcus Peterson, who'd progressed from cooperative worker to regional anchor business consultant, helping other communities develop their own locally owned enterprise. It was audible in conversations with families who could plan for the future rather than just survive the present. It was measurable in population trends that showed rural communities growing rather than declining for the first time in decades. The girl who'd been told she'd never leave Millfield had not only left but had brought resources back that were transforming rural communities across America. The woman who'd been dismissed as unqualified to manage federal policy had designed and implemented programs that were reshaping how Washington approached rural development. But perhaps most importantly, the policies I'd developed were giving other young people in rural communities options I'd never had. The possibility of building meaningful careers in the places where they'd grown up, contributing to community development rather than being forced to choose between personal ambition and local commitment. Standing in my White House office 3 years after that first bewildering phone call, looking out at the Washington Monument while reviewing reports from anchor businesses across the country, I understood that the most profound changes weren't in rural policy or federal programming. They were in the recognition that expertise comes from experience, that innovation requires people who understand problems from the inside, and that the most effective federal policies are designed by people who have lived the realities those policies are meant to address. My sister had been wrong about more than my capabilities. She'd been wrong about what success meant, what leaving home meant, and what it meant to never forget where you came from. Sometimes the people who doubt you the most give you exactly the motivation you need to prove them wrong in ways they never imagined possible. The phone rang with another community requesting technical assistance for anchor business development. I answered it the same way I'd answered hundreds of similar calls. White House Rural Development Office, Madison Thompson speaking. How can we help your community build a sustainable economic future? Because that's what federal service really means. Using the resources of the government to help people build the lives they want in the places they love. And that's a mission worth every challenge it takes to accomplish. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe, and hit that bell to never miss our latest upload.